Hello, world. This is Talking Live. We're glad you tuned in today, and we have a special guest here, Jose Stelle. Very educated man. We are proud to have him on our show. Okay, Mr. Stelle, we appreciate you, the fact you do a show with us, and I've been doing a little study up on you, and you've been around the world, and hey, you do a lot of stuff, as earlier you talked about where you was in, wasn't Japan, you was doing a stuff, what was that?
Well, let's start with, my background. I grew up in Brazil. I had a pretty European traditional education in middle school, which was very important to me later on. And then I came to America for college. I went to Brigham Young University in Utah. Not a Mormon, but that's where I went. I had a scholarship there. And I studied art for many years, painting, sculpture, design, things like that. Then, because of my interest, which is something that I developed as a child, an interest in reading, I ended up going to the University of Iowa for English degree. And then I went to Brazil, worked for several years, came back to America, taught art and English at different universities in Florida. And in my old age, decided to get a doctorate degree in international studies, which is a field that involves philosophy, politics, and economics. To give you a well-rounded education in the political sense, let's say, right? To make appropriate judgment and understand what's happening in the world and in their own country, right? And my thesis was about the American Constitution, a critique of it, and ideas for constitutional reform, because I find that the problems of America, which I'm in, are they come out of the Constitution, especially out of Article 1, which created democratic electoral way of putting people in power instead of the Republican constitutional way. And I attribute most of the problems in America to mistakes in the Constitution, especially Article 1. There are some other articles also that give considerable power to the central government. And I have severe doubts about the fact that the president has command of the armed forces, which is something that one of the main founding father was James Madison, thought was a mistake. He thought that should be a separate power, maybe coming out of the defense committee of the Senate or something like that. Right? So we have problems of severe concentration of power in the American system. And today we're running a deficit of $36 trillion.
Yes.
Sure. And I'll give you the idea of how bad things have become. For example, around 1810, taxation was about 3% of the gross national product that we can sort of figure out it was at the time. Around 1910, it was 8%. Today, we're probably past 50% when you consider federal, state, local, and all these other taxes and fees and things we have to pay. We work at least half a year to pay taxes. And we have, as a result of the industrialization of of legislation. I think that this leads us to the very problem of democracy. For example, the writers of the Constitution, the so-called founding fathers, they were, at least in theory, against the idea of democracy, which because they knew history and what happened in Rome and what happened in Greece in particular, they knew that democracy leads to demagoguery and the lies to the that let us get votes. And in the end, you end up with, as Plato said, in the end, you end up with a tyranny of some sort, some kind of despotism, which comes out of democracy, right? And so they actually see that the word democracy is not in the Constitution. The word democratic is not in the Constitution. But this system, the electoral system, or let's say the so-called representative system that was put into the Article 1 of the Constitution, actually empowered the very idea of democracy that they were trying to fight against, right? Because right from the start, in Article, as soon as the Constitution was approved, you have something that bothered President Washington a lot, which in his third year in office, he started to take notes. And out of these notes came his warnings in his farewell address, which was not an address, it was something just published in the papers, right? Which is very wise. Of course, it was written by James Madison and Emerson, Alexander Hamilton. But out of the notes that Washington had taken, apparently, and there's a warning there about the danger of factionalism, right? Factions. Today we call factions parties, but they're still factions. And factions do not represent, let's say, the opinion of the people or the will of the people or the general way that people think, the sense of justice that the people apply to government. Is actually not present in the system, because everything has to do with winning the next election and selling particular partisan products to an ignorant population that they themselves confuse with their advertising and everything. And today, of course, it was done in the papers in the old days, right?
So you're saying they're putting stuff into our system that they think's realistic, and we're not even thinking about that.
Yeah,
that's what you're saying,
right? I'm saying that, and this is something that's conservatives and even classical liberals, they're all in favor of democracy somehow, and they don't realize that Plato, great critic of democracy, even Solon, the legislator, Athens, that created all kinds of laws that would try to undermine the power of the interest groups in terms of controlling the government, right? As Plutarch, in his biography of Solon remarks, it didn't quite work that way. And gradually, the organized interest, using the democratic method of, getting the people in assemblies to shout out loud and say, "This is terrible, this is tyranny," whatever. All these laws that restrain our desire to do things. In other words, they were trying to destroy the law.
Brainwash, what you're saying.
Well, sure. And how did these? Plato talks about this. He says, okay, this is something said also by comedian George Carlin. Forget the politicians; they are not running the show. There are powerful interests behind it that are actually funding the whole thing, paying these people, contributing to their re-elections and elections in order to get what they want, right? To get the legislation that helps them. I'll give you an example. In 2000, I announced my candidacy for a seat in the House of Representatives in Florida, right? And as soon as my name came out in the papers, I started getting these supposed invitations from the different interest groups, right? Chamber of Commerce, Builders Association, Teachers Association, pretending that they were actually inviting me, but actually basically threatening me to come over, or we're going to work against you, or we cannot fund you. So the first one was the Chamber of Commerce of Palm Beach County. So I went over there, ready to answer their questions. And they said, well, Mr. Stelle, what is it that you pretend to do if you get elected? And then I said, well, there is a lot of injustice in the system. There's, there are things, for example, that are false rights given to particular groups. There's also a lot of regulation of business, and I thought you gentlemen will be interested in this, that the regulation of business actually stifles business, goes against the working of the market, messes up the market. I said, why don't we work together to, get rid of this? I said, what we really need to concentrate on is the complete application of the rule of law, in the sense of, not in the sense of anything that's written by the legislature, but in the sense, because that's part of every law. Parties are incapable of creating law. That's one of the problems we know. I said, general rules, prospective, abstract, equally applicable to all, to government agents as well as to individuals, so that we have, greater justice in the state of Florida. And they started, kind of leaning to one side and kind of snickering to one another. They said, this guy here is really stupid. He doesn't understand politics, right? And of course, I knew this was going to happen. So I said, well, I think the best way for us to, understand each other is, why don't you tell me what you want, right? What is it that you're looking for? Bill. And the president of the Chamber of Commerce, in a loud voice, said, access. And I knew that what he meant by access, but I said, well, can you, sure. I pretended not to understand, and I said, sure. If I get elected, my office will be open 24/7. Anything that you need, anything that's just, that according to justice and the rule of law, let's work together to solve the problem. And they started snickering and laughing again, And we went on like that for a little bit. And then one of them said, well, Mr. Stelle, you're really an upstanding citizen, concerned with justice and the rule of law and all that. But that's not how democracy works. I said, I know that's not how democracy works. And that's why I'm running. Right. So after a little while, they said, well, do you have any other questions? Right there. Whenever in an interview you get that question, it's coming to an end. What's your question? I said, well, you admitted that I am, concerned with justice and better Florida, even though we disagreed here to some extent. Even so, can you make a contribution to my campaign? And the president of the Chamber of Commerce said, no. It's like that, aggressively like that. And that was the end of the conversation. Okay, next week, a few days later, I go over to the Builders Association, Yeah, and the same thing happened. They wanted to know, okay, how much money are you going to vote for to build new schools and to build new roads and whatever? Then they wanted the business for themselves. And so on and so forth. And that's how it is. That is what Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution and all the state constitutions has created. The idea that the people are in control, that democracy is governed of the people, for the people, by the people, of course, It's never the people. It's only the people have the right to vote, right? What do you call they are actually the people, and they are only 1/3 of the population, right? So the whole theory of democracy is wrong. Because it's wrong in practice, it doesn't work, right?
What is the real meaning of real democracy?
Okay, let's say, philosophically speaking, let's say, or rationally, it would mean that everybody agrees on something. I give you an example. I used to belong to a philosophical group that came to study a couple of times a week in Fort Lauderdale, every week, right? Philosophical problems. That was the Society of Philosophers there. So one of the rules of this group was that whenever we do anything, we have to agree 100%. If there's 15 people there, we have to 15 votes in favor of this particular thing. Different things. Some practical, some theoretical. And so when we had any decisions to make, it wouldn't be made today. Sometimes it could take 3 months of talking and brainstorming for, different. It's the same thing that happened probably in Philadelphia during the convention in 1787. And all kinds of, nobody knows what's happening. People have different ideas, and gradually you begin to kind of go up sort of an evolutionary circle in which things get more and more defined, and everybody begins to understand what the situation, what's the context, and given the context, what is the right solution or the right thing to do based on this context. But so after 3 months, maybe we were discussing, then somebody would say, okay, let's do this. And immediately, as a result of all that process, immediately everybody said, yeah, because that was the right idea. Everybody recognized that that's the right idea. I would say that's democracy, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, that does not happen in Congress. To begin with, they have the idea of just one vote, right? Let's say in the House is one vote, in the Senate is 60%, but they would like to get it to be 51%, right? Why? Because it's convenient for the party people to have those narrow margins. And then they say, this is the will of the people. Of course it is. But 51% in Congress is not even 51 of the American people, because 2/3 of the people don't vote, right? They're teenagers, or the elderly, people in prison, children. The people who have the right to vote, they're about 1/3 of the population, maybe just slightly over. Let's take a look at what happens, for example. So this is what democracy is. Okay, but this is something that happens under the particular rules. In other words, it's the rules of the organization, and then let's say the rules of the government, the Constitution, if it's well written, that produces, after so many months or years, a particular way of thinking and a particular way of voting, and then you know that you're doing the right thing. What happened, for example, let's understand how this whole thing happened, how we came to, let's say, to this idea of representation that comes out of the Constitution. This started, it's a reaction in the 17th century against monarchy, against the power of the king. And this started mostly in France and in England. Let's take the question of the levelers. The levelers were a group of people interested in politics, some good thinkers, some fight thinkers, and they came up with the idea. They had a misunderstanding of what happened in ancient Greece in the old days and in Rome and all that. They had but they were desperate for something to go against this power of the monarchy. And the power of the monarchy at the time, let's say today the president gets a salary, right? In the old days, the president was the king. The king did not have a salary, right? he needed to get money for his family and his palaces and everything else. And so what they did is they sold monopolies to, they sold the power monopoly to different groups. Let's say ABC News gives me, $10 million, and ABC News is the only one that's going to show news in America, right? And so they had the tobacco, they had the tobacco monopoly, the sugar monopoly, all kinds of grain monopoly, in other words, and that's how they lived. And as a result of this, let's say, military-industrial complex of that time, right? The people were paying lots of taxes, getting no benefits, and the rich were running the show, basically, right? So these levelers, these thinkers of England thought, okay, let's make instead of having the king, who is oppressive, now we're going to have democracy, and so the people will be kicked, right? And the people, by voting, then, of course, they're never going to vote against themselves, right? So we're going to have freedom as a result of it. So they wanted, they even rejected the idea of property qualification. I don't know if you know what that is. It's something that conservatives, at least in England, maybe even in America, defend to this day, that you cannot vote unless you have property, right? Because they said at the time, in order to vote or have any kind of power in the kingdom, you have to have an interest in the kingdom. And a property owner will always have some sort of interest. If you're just walking down the street and you don't have property, then how can you vote, right? But the levelers thought, no, everybody should vote. Anybody who's 18 years old should vote, right? Yeah, because that appears to be, in theory, the right thing to do. But the people of Cromwell, this was the English Civil War, 1650 or so. Cromwell said, no, let's have the property qualification, because otherwise the demagogues, the agitators of the masses and of the poor, are going to use their vote to confiscate property and establish a communist system, right? Yeah. Which had happened, by the way, in Greece in the old days. Socialism was not invented by Karl Marx or anybody like that. It existed in ancient Greece as a result of the electoral process, of the democratic process of the destroyed Athens, right? So let's see, the idea that you should own something in order to vote is an important concept, that political concept. What do the Democrats, the radical Democrats, who are basically socialist in their thinking, right, communistic in their thinking, what do they want? They want, even in Brazil, if you're 16 years old, in order for the socialists to enlarge the base of support, they're allowing 16-year-olds to vote for president or something, right? Yeah. These people haven't even served in the military yet. How can they, I would say that maybe if you serve if you're in the service, maybe you have the right to vote. But if you were 16 years old, you don't, right?
Yeah, I would say a 16-year-old came in back in the cities and worked to take it over by
Yeah, Aristotle already said that in his stuff. He said that the young should not be allowed to have any power in deciding political matters, because they're inexperienced and they're too emotional. They don't have a lot of education and experience. They haven't raised a child. They haven't done any of these things that adults usually go through. And as a result of that experience, they acquire some sort of a little bit of wisdom, something like that.
Absolutely, don't know nothing about life.
About life, yeah. And then, of course, at the time of the American Revolution, why did the Americans rebel against England? Because this idea of pure democracy had taken over Parliament, to the point that Parliament was basically saying, they actually said this to the Americans: Parliament represents the people. We can do no wrong, right? So all of these taxes that they were levying, that they were trying to get out of the American colonies, from the democratic point of view, was correct. That's right. Because after all, they was voted by the majority, and this majority won in Parliament, right? You see what I mean? And that's how the Americans were defending the idea of the rule of law. The idea that law is not just something that a majority of people write in the legislature. Law has to have certain attributes. It has to have certain qualities. If it does not have those qualities, which is abstraction, generality, the equal applicability, right? The prospectivity, you cannot have a retroactive law. When it's approved, it's from now on. You can't kick it back to January 1st like they do in Congress all the time. They say, we pass a law in July. They say, well, it's retroactive to January what? That's contrary to the rule of law. Because all the actions taken during those 6 months or 7 months were taken, in a sense, in contravention of that law. So the whole thing is in. So we live in a kind of a crazy system. And where does the crazy system come from? Where did taxation get to the point where we live, we're sort of living in what Friedrich Hayek called the road to serfdom. I don't know if you read the book or heard about the book. It came out in 1944. He called the road to serfdom. He says, and this road to serfdom is not pure communism or this, prison camps in the Soviet Union, anything like. It's a kind of a quiet despotism that you don't even know is happening to you, but that wears you down every day, makes you, unable to resist, and because it takes over your mind. And of course, even the educational system nowadays is being used to indoctrinate children in a particular way so that for the rest of their lives, they'll vote in a particular way, right?
Thanks for joining us today. You have been watching part one of our very insightful interview with Jose Stelle. Don't miss it as we continue our discussion in part 2 of our show, next time right here on Talkin' Live.
Thanks for joining us today. To watch this show again, be sure to visit talkinlive.com. We now have Roku and Amazon Fire TV channels for you to watch from your home TV. Or find more of our recent shows on most any of your favorite social media platforms. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Good night, world. We will be talking live with you next time. The views and opinions expressed on all Talkin' Live presentations are those of the host and their guests, and not necessarily those of the staff or management of the Talkin' Live TV broadcast studio, or by this channel or its management.